Halima prided herself on restraint. As the head curator of one of Lagos' most prestigious art galleries, she had built a reputation on poise, intellect, and an unshakable sense of control. Every decision was measured, every movement deliberate. In a world where perception was everything, she was always 10 steps ahead. And then came Malik. She had first noticed him at an exhibition 3 months ago, standing among a group of artists, his presence impossible to ignore. There was something about the way he carried himself, unapologetic, effortless. He didn't just exist in a space, he commanded it. At first, she dismissed him as another young artist with more ego than talent. But then she saw his work. His paintings were raw, almost violent in their emotion, each stroke on the canvas brimming with unfiltered passion. His art was everything she had spent years suppressing, wild, untamed, free. He had caught her staring that night. "You disapprove?" His voice had been smooth, teasing. "Not at all," she had replied coolly. "Your work is unrestrained." His gaze had lingered on her, a slow, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "And is that a bad thing?" She had walked away then, unwilling to entertain the heat pulling in her stomach. But avoiding him had proven impossible. He had a way of appearing at every event, always just close enough to remind her he was watching. And she hated how aware she was of it. Tonight was no different. The gallery was alive with murmurs and the soft clinking of champagne glasses as Lagos elite admired the latest collection. Halima stood near the entrance, listening with half-interest to a patron's ramblings about the evolution of contemporary African art. But her senses were elsewhere, locked onto the man standing at the far end of the room, speaking with one of the sponsors. Malik. He was dressed in a dark-fitted suit, but there was nothing refined about the way he wore it. His presence was magnetic, drawing attention without effort. And at that moment, as if he could feel her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met. A slow smirk curved his lips, and then, without hesitation, he started walking toward her. She should have looked away. She should have left the room. But she remained rooted to the spot, pulse hammering as he stopped just close enough for her to catch the scent of his cologne, something rich and dark, like cedar wood and spice. "Halima." His voice was a quiet challenge. She forced her expression into its usual mask of indifference. "Malik." His eyes flickered with amusement. "You always say my name like it's dangerous." "That's because it is," she murmured, surprised by her own honesty. Something in his gaze darkened. He stepped closer, just enough for their fingers to brush. It was the barest of touches, but it sent a jolt through her, igniting something she had spent months pretending didn't exist. His voice was lower when he spoke again, barely audible above the noise of the gallery. "Tell me to stop." Halima opened her mouth. The word "stop" balanced on the edge of her tongue, ready to be spoken, ready to end this before it spiraled out of control. But she didn't say it. And as silence stretched between them, she knew this was the moment she would fall. There would be no going back. The silence between them was deafening. Halima should have walked away, should have excused herself with some polite, meaningless words. But she stood there, pulse unsteady, staring into Malik's eyes as if they held answers she wasn't ready to hear. He didn't move. He didn't press. He just waited. "Halima," a voice called, shattering the moment. She blinked, stepping back as if waking from a dream. It was Idros, one of the gallery's investors, smiling as he approached. "I need your opinion on a piece." It was the escape she needed. She turned to Malik briefly, willing her voice to stay steady. "Excuse me." Without waiting for his response, she followed Idris, each step an effort to ignore the burning awareness still thrumming in her veins. Later that night, Halima closed the door to her penthouse and exhaled. The evening had been a success. The gallery had secured new investors, and the exhibition had been well received. By all measures, it had been a perfect night. So why did she feel so unsteady? She tossed her heels aside and walked barefoot across the polished floor, heading straight for the bar. Pouring herself a glass of wine, she leaned against the counter, eyes shutting as she took a slow sip. A soft chime broke the silence. Her phone. She reached for it, expecting a message from one of the patrons or perhaps Idris. But it wasn't. Malik, you never told me to stop. Her breath hitched. She should ignore it. She should delete the message and put an end to this ridiculous temptation. But her fingers moved before logic could intervene. Halima, I should have. The three dots appeared almost immediately. Malik, but you didn't. She clenched her jaw, placing the phone down before she made a mistake. The wine did nothing to soothe her. She paced to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering city below, as if the view could ground her. Another chime. She didn't check. A few minutes passed, and then her phone rang. She stared at the screen. Malik. Her heart pounded as she hesitated. Then, almost in defiance of her own better judgment, she answered. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence was thick, electric. Then his voice came, deep and smooth. Are you alone? Her fingers tightened around the glass. Yes. A bit of silence. Then, open your door. Her breath caught. Malik. Open it. She should say no. She should end the call. But instead, she walked. Each step toward the door felt like stepping toward something inevitable. She hesitated for a single second before unlocking it and pulling it open. And there he was. Dressed in a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled up, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made the air between them hum. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Then, as if some invisible tether snapped, he reached for her. And Halima, the woman who had spent years perfecting control, let herself fall. The moment Malik's hands touched her, Halima forgot how to breathe. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just the crash of two forces that had spent too long resisting the inevitable. He pulled her against him, his heat searing through the silk of her dress. She felt his breath against her cheek, his scent, dark and intoxicating, wrapping around her like a spell. You knew this would happen, he murmured, his fingers grazing the bare skin of her arm. She did. She had known it from the first moment she saw him, from the first time his eyes lingered too long, from the first time she let them. But knowing hadn't stopped her from opening the door. And now, there was no space left for caution. Halima reached up, threading her fingers into his hair, pulling him down as her lips met his in a kiss that was anything but careful. It was fire, burning, consuming. Malik responded instantly, his hands gripping her waist, pressing her back against the door as if anchoring himself to her. She wasn't sure who deepened the kiss first, only that when it happened, the rest of the world ceased to exist. She was losing herself in him. In the way he tasted, bold and unapologetic. In the way his hands traced the curve of her back, his touch igniting a heat she hadn't felt in years. And then, as suddenly as it started, she broke away. Breathless. Shaken. Malik didn't move, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing just as uneven. Say it, he murmured. She swallowed, her heart a wild rhythm in her chest. Say what? That you don't want this. His fingers brushed her jaw, tilting her face up. His eyes, dark, searching, held hers captive. That you don't want me. She opened her mouth. The words should be easy. She had spent years choosing logic over impulse, control over chaos. She should be able to stop this. But she couldn't. Instead, she whispered the one truth she could no longer deny. I do. The tension in Malik's shoulders loosened, a slow, knowing smile curving his lips. Then stop running. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because she wasn't sure she knew how to. The morning after, Halima woke to the soft golden light filtering through her curtains. The sheets were warm, the scent of Malik still lingering on her skin. She turned, expecting to find him beside her. But the space was empty. Her stomach tightened. Pushing the covers aside, she slipped out of bed, grabbing the silk robe from the chair as she made her way to the living room. He was there. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, coffee in hand, watching the city come to life. For a moment, she just watched him, how effortlessly he fit into her space, how his presence made it feel less empty. Then, as if sensing her, he turned. His eyes met hers, and a slow smirk touched his lips. Morning. Her throat was dry. You stayed. Was I supposed to leave? She didn't know the answer to that. Malik placed his cup down and walked toward her, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. If you regret it, say so. She exhaled, pressing her palm against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. I don't. His hand lifted to her face, fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. Good. He kissed her then, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that promised this wasn't just a fleeting mistake. And Halima, for the first time in years, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, letting go of control wasn't the worst thing after all. For the next few days, Halima told herself this was temporary. A moment of weakness, a distraction. Nothing more. But distractions weren't supposed to feel like this. She hadn't expected how easy it would be to fall into a rhythm with Malik, the stolen moments in between her gallery meetings, the late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, the way he seemed to know her in ways no one else did. And the way he touched her. It was dangerous. Addictive. She had spent years building walls, but Malik didn't just climb them, he tore them down with every look, every touch, every whisper challenge. One evening at the gallery, Halima was in her office, reviewing the final details for an upcoming exhibition when her phone buzzed. Malik, I'm downstairs. She glanced at the time. It was after 10 p.m. The gallery was closed, and everyone had left hours ago. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed, why? A few seconds passed. Then, Malik, you know why. She inhaled sharply, her heart pounding. She could tell him to leave. She should tell him to leave. But instead, she grabbed her keys and made her way to the private entrance. When she opened the door, Malik was leaning casually against his car, dressed in a simple white shirt and jeans, his expression unreadable. The streetlights cast a soft glow on his features, making him look both impossibly young and dangerously intense. She folded her arms. You shouldn't be here. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. Then tell me to go. She hated the way he said it, like he already knew she wouldn't. Halima sighed, turning to walk back inside. But before she could take another step, he reached for her wrist, pulling her back just enough that their bodies nearly touched. His voice was low. Why do you keep fighting this? Because she had to. Because he was younger, because he was unpredictable, because if she let this continue, she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to stop. But instead of saying any of that, she whispered, because I don't know how to want you and keep my life the same. Malik's fingers tightened around hers. Maybe it's not supposed to stay the same. She hated how easily he unraveled her. How every carefully built layer of self-control melted under his touch. His lips brushed against her ear. Tell me to leave, Halima. She closed her eyes. Then, instead of pushing him away, she pulled him inside. The next morning, Halima stood at the kitchen counter, watching as Malik moved through her space like he belonged there. Barefoot, shirt unbuttoned, making coffee as if this was normal. As if they were normal. She shook her head. "You're too comfortable." He turned, smacking. "Is that a problem?" "Yes." Because this was never supposed to be more than a mistake. A beautiful, reckless mistake. She grabbed her phone and checked her schedule, trying to regain control of her thoughts. But before she could focus, Malik stepped behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. His lips grazed her shoulder. "Stop thinking so much." She exhaled. "You don't understand." Malik turned her in his arms, his gaze serious now. "Then make me understand." She hesitated, her fingers gripping his shirt. "You and I, we don't make sense." His jaw tensed. "Because of my age?" Because she was supposed to be the woman who had everything together. Because Malik wasn't the kind of man you had a carefully controlled affair with, he was the kind who consumed you. And yet, here they were. His fingers tilted her chin up. "What if I don't care about making sense?" Halima swallowed. "And what happens when this stops being exciting?" He studied her, then said simply, "You tell me." And for the first time since this began, she wondered if she was the one afraid of the answer. For days, Halima convinced herself she had control. That this thing with Malik existed in a carefully contained space, separate from the life she had built. She was wrong. It happened on a Friday evening. The gallery was hosting an exclusive art auction, a high-profile event attended by Lagos' most influential collectors. Halima had been in her element all night, poised, composed, untouchable. Until she saw him. Not Malik. Him. Femi allayed. The man she had spent years trying to forget. The man who had once held her heart in his hands, and crushed it without hesitation. Her breath stalled as she watched him step into the gallery, looking just as powerful as he had the day she walked away from him. His suit was perfectly tailored, his presence commanding, his sharp gaze scanning the room. And then, inevitably, it found her. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. Halima's fingers curled into fists. She had spent years avoiding this moment. She turned, ready to disappear before he could reach her, but she wasn't fast enough. "Halima," his voice came, smooth and deliberate. She forced herself to face him. "Femi." He took his time studying her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You look unchanged." She lifted her chin. "You look unwelcome." He chuckled, as if her resistance was entertaining. Still sharp-tongued, "I see." His gaze dropped to her hand, the one she had unconsciously rested on her hip. No ring. Her lips thinned. No interest. Femi tilted his head, as if considering her. "So you really never forgave me?" Halima inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain unaffected. "I forgot about you a long time ago, Femi." He smacked. "Liar." Before she could respond, another voice cut in, smooth, confident, laced with something unmistakably territorial. "Is there a problem here?" Halima stiffened. She knew that voice. Malik. He stood beside her now, hands in his pockets, his gaze locked onto Femi with a calmness that was far more dangerous than open hostility. Femi raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking between them before settling on Malik. "And you are?" Malik's lips curled into the slightest smirk. The man she didn't forget. The air between them tightened. Femi chuckled, shaking his head. "Interesting." He turned back to Halima, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "I wonder how long that will last." With that, he walked away, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Halima let out a slow breath, but before she could steady herself, Malik spoke. Who was that? His voice was calm, but she could feel the tension beneath it. She hesitated, then exhaled. Someone who should have stayed in my past. Malik studied her for a long moment. Then, you're still in love with him. Her heart lurched. What? You still feel something? His voice was low, unreadable. And I need to know if I'm just filling the space he left behind. The question knocked the breath from her lungs. Because the truth? She didn't know the answer. And for the first time since falling into this reckless affair, she was terrified. Halima had always been good at compartmentalizing. But tonight, with Malik watching her like he could see right through her, those compartments were crumbling. You're still in love with him, Malik had said. The words clung to the air between them, heavy, undeniable. She wanted to deny it. To tell him that Femi was nothing but a ghost from her past. But she couldn't form the words. Not with the way her pulse was racing. Not with the way her skin still burned from Femi's presence. Malik exhaled, shaking his head. You don't have to say anything. Your silence says enough. Malik, she started, reaching for him, but he took a step back. I asked you once if I was just a distraction, he murmured. I think I finally have my answer. The ache in his voice made her chest tighten. She had wanted this to stay simple, effortless. But nothing about Malik had ever been simple. And now, Femi had shattered whatever illusion of control she had left. I need time, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik studied her, his jaw clenching. Then, with a slow nod, he said, take it. And then he was gone. Halima barely had time to process the weight of his absence before she felt another presence behind her. You always did have a habit of running from things, Femi murmured, his voice smooth as silk. She turned sharply, her temper flaring. What the hell do you want, Femi? He smirked, stepping closer. Just to talk. She scoffed. You don't get to just talk after what you did. Femi's expression darkened, the arrogance slipping, just for a moment. You really think I came back after all these years for nothing? The sudden seriousness in his tone sent a chill through her. What are you talking about? She demanded. He leaned in, his voice low. You think I'm here because of us? No, Halima. This is bigger than that. Bigger than you and me. She frowned. What? But before she could finish, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. I'll explain everything soon, he said, already turning away. Femi. Stay out of this, Halima. He shot her a look. For your own good. And just like that, he disappeared into the crowd. Halima stood frozen, heart pounding. This wasn't just about old wounds or unfinished feelings. Something was wrong. And she had a sinking feeling she was about to find out just how much. To be continued. Please share, subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories. Thank you.